The purpose of this video is to introduce the different properties of water. The first one that we're going to talk about is a property called cohesion. You're going to use all of the properties of water discussed in this video when it comes to your first lab. But to talk about cohesion, even though it's something you may have never heard about, it is something that you've all witnessed. If you've ever seen water beating up on the windshield of a car, that is due to cohesion taking place. If we get our honorary blue lightsaber here in honor of the water video, we'll take a look at this picture. I'm sure everyone has seen something like this where the water ends up beating up on the windshield. It's the property of cohesion that causes the water molecules to stick together. If you've ever wondered why the water doesn't just form a thin film over the entire windshield, why it beads up in these little areas, that's all because of cohesion, this property of the water molecules sticking to one another. The other major property that we're going to talk about is called adhesion. This is actually also seen in our image over here. The water molecules don't just slide right off the windshield. They end up sticking in one place. That's because water is then sticking to the glass, and the property of water sticking to something other than water is the concept of adhesion. Now, in order to talk about why water behaves this way, we do have to discuss a little bit about the chemical makeup of a water molecule. By now, hopefully everybody's familiar with the idea that H2O is water. This tells us that a water molecule is made up of 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. Now, I'm not trying to turn this into chemistry class. I think we've established at this point that Mr. Snelling is my nemesis over there across the hall, and most of what he teaches as, quote, chemistry is pure witchcraft. But this concept is somewhat valid for our purposes in biology. But if we write the actual chemical makeup for a water molecule, 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen, they're actually held together by these lines which represent electrons. One of the things we'll talk about next chapter when we discuss the parts of an atom are electrons. They're the negative part of an atom, and in this case this bar represents an electron that is shared between hydrogen and oxygen. The sharing of that electron is actually what bonds this water molecule together. So it's the property of basically sharing this electron between the hydrogen and the oxygen that keep the water molecules together. The chemistry property for this is a covalent bond. We'll talk about a couple different types of bonding coming up next chapter. But what this does is it makes the water molecule kind of unbalanced. The way to think about this is oxygen is like much bigger and stronger than the hydrogens. The technical term in chemistry is that it has more electron affinity, meaning it's going to be pulling harder on the electron that they're sharing. The easy kind of common sense way of thinking about this is think of this line as tug of war. The oxygen is much stronger than the hydrogens, so that higher electron affinity makes it stronger, and it ends up pulling the electrons closer to the oxygen side and away from the hydrogen side. What that ends up doing, since electrons are negative, is it makes the oxygen side slightly negative and the hydrogen side slightly positive. What happens now if we get other water molecules coming along so that water bead on your windshield is growing? The way that they end up arranging themselves is with the oxygen on this side and the 2 hydrogens on the other side. The reason for that is just like with magnets, the positive and the negative sides are attracted to one another. So in this sense, we have the positive hydrogen end attracted to the negative oxygen end, and then the same thing on the other side, and this ends up holding these water molecules together in those little beads that you see on the car. So unfortunately, even though we try to do as little of the witchcraft of the chemistry as possible, this is one concept where we do have to talk about that one a little bit. So you should know the structure of a water molecule and that idea of the oxygen pulling more of the electrons to its side, making it more negative, and thereby making the hydrogen side a little bit more positive. Just to give you something for these terms so you have something to write down, cohesion is when you have water molecules sticking to other water molecules. If we're thinking about adhesion, we're still discussing water molecules, but they're sticking to something other than a water molecule. Doesn't really matter what it is. It could be water droplets sticking on the inside of a plastic water bottle that you're drinking from. It could be condensation on the outside of a glass. It really doesn't matter. The last thing for us to talk about is called capillary action. This is actually cohesion and adhesion at the same time. If we blow this one up, all this is showing you is some water molecules inside of a test tube. So this would be like the walls of the test tube on either side. And then this is the water on the inside. If you've ever used a test tube in science class before, you know that the water doesn't just sit straight across. It forms this little dip, a depression. This is called a meniscus. It makes it a little bit harder to read exactly how much water you have in a test tube or in a graduated cylinder, something to use to measure with. The reason this happens is because the adhesion forces are stronger than the cohesion forces. So over here, we have an example of adhesion. We have a water molecule sticking to something other than a water molecule, sticking to the glass on the side of the test tube, whereas here in the middle, we have cohesion taking place, the water molecules sticking to each other. So since the adhesion forces are stronger, the water kind of ends up with this curved, almost like hammock shape. Again, we call this one the idea of a meniscus. Typically when you're reading, you read at the bottom of the meniscus, just to make things consistent, because it's easier to see that part. If we're trying to read at the top of the meniscus, that can become really challenging depending on how exactly you're holding the test tube. So these are the three terms you have to know in order to work your way through the lab. You'll actually develop a hypothesis based on the information you now know about cohesion, water molecules sticking to other water molecules, adhesion, water molecules sticking to something other than water, and then this idea of capillary action, which is basically adhesion and cohesion at the same time, with the understanding that adhesion is stronger. Thank you for watching, and make sure you take a minute to watch or to answer the questions at the end of the video.